I think you can hear it and you can see it. Well, I will leave the floor to a man who shouldn't be introduced to most of you, Professor Nolkemper, the Dean of the Faculty of Law of the University of Amsterdam, and also the President of the European Society of International Law. Thank you very much, Professor.
So thank you, Marco, and thank you, Elsa, for setting up this event. I'm indeed here in a dual capacity as newly appointed Dean of the Law School, but I guess more so in my capacity as President of the European Society of International Law, which, in case you do not know, is a European-wide society with well over 1,000 members, organizing a range of activities throughout Europe. I can point forwards to our next annual conference in Riga in September. And for those of you who are not yet a member, please join. And if you're not convinced yet, wait until the lecture and you can always join afterwards. So one of the many things we do is to organize ESIL lectures, which are lectures by people of name and fame and interesting insights. So we have lectures by Rosalind Higgins, Philip Elliott, Judge Sicilianos, dozens of lectures which are all on the ESIL website and on the YouTube channel, and which easily hit 10,000 views or more. So the turnout today is excellent, but the number of people who will actually watch today's lecture, and perhaps even including the Q&A session afterwards, if that meets the standards that we hope to achieve, that too will be taped on the YouTube channel. So we're delighted that as our next speaker in the ESIL lecture series, we have Professor James Hathaway, Professor of Law at Michigan Law School and distinguished visiting professor at the University of Amsterdam. Professor Hathaway visits Amsterdam every year to teach a class in Professor Ziek's course on international refugee law, and we're delighted that he will speak on this occasion also in this series of the ESIL lecture series. The topic is a daunting one. We all in Europe as international lawyers have struggled to find or to think of legal responses, legal avenues to address the migration and refugee problem as they have evolved over the previous month. And I guess more than a few of you are here with the hope, perhaps even expectation, that Professor Hathaway will finally show us where the road should lead from here. Professor Hathaway, please take the floor. Professor Hathaway speaks for about 45 minutes to 1 hour, and afterwards we have a Q&A until the questions dry up.
Sorry. Well, good afternoon. And let me add my appreciation to that already expressed to you. As a Canadian, I understand the importance of the first warm weather of spring and the political incorrectness of asking anybody to be inside on a spring Friday afternoon. So you're a wonderful group to be here. Thank you to Dean Nolkemper, to Professor Ziek, to the European Law Students Association, and to ESIL for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. And Andre is right. This is a daunting topic. I also happen to believe it's a topic that may have relevance in the developed world for the first time in a long time. And that as horrible as the current moment seems, it's a moment of hope that for once the states of the developed world may see some of the horror that has routinely afflicted states of the global south for many decades. The horror that comes from a refugee system that is largely dysfunctional, which we can now see. And the aspiration then is that by seeing that more clearly than we have in moments of relative calm, we'll understand, as those in the global south have for many decades understood, that the system needs to be fixed. It needs to be operationalized in a way that is very different from the current reality. So let me begin with the obvious. Unless you've had your head in the sand for the last 6 or 8 months, you'll have seen scenes like this one of refugees in tiny boats surrendering their well-being to smugglers in dangerous conditions. And photos like this, that even when they manage somehow to get to safety in Europe, that safety often proves elusive when they run up against barbed wire barriers or other impediments to actually seeking the protection as refugees that they've told is on offer. If they get in, refugees often living in squalid conditions and unable to get on with remaking their lives. And I think we need to add into the paradigm scenes of appalling acts of terror inflicted on host countries by persons who claim to be affiliated with some of the same forces that are producing the refugee flows themselves. This is a mess. This is not a good place to be. And I think as a starting point for international lawyers, the question might logically arise, why do we want to fix something like this? Wouldn't it be better just to fix the problems that make people refugees in the first place, rather than trying to fix the palliative system that picks up the pieces when people are at risk? Shouldn't we simply stop people from getting hurt in the first place? Wouldn't that be a better investment of our time and energy? And at one level, in principle, the answer has to be yes, that would be a better place to be. But at the risk of offending many international lawyers, and not intending to lampoon, but nonetheless being candid, those other systems don't work well. We have, for example, the international human rights law system that in theory is a system that the governments of the world have agreed to ensure human dignity, threats to which are what produce refugees. And yet that system still has virtually no coercive force, least of all with the governments determined to ignore or hurt their own people. Some would say, well, isn't that then the international security system's job? Isn't that why we have a UN Charter and a Security Council? And the answer, of course, is yes, that is. But we all know the stories. The Security Council has been perennially locked in fights amongst its permanent members, rarely able to act decisively, always denied the standing military force that the Charter envisaged, that it could have deployed quickly and efficiently in difficult situations, largely by acts of the United States government. And so we've been left with, at best, individual states and sometimes so-called coalitions of the willing that undertake, quote, humanitarian intervention, unquote, as the least bad option. But those interventions, if we're equally candid, have normally not lived up to the promise of the Charter. They've instead produced disasters of the kind that we see in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Libya. Well, a decade ago, we thought we could fix all of that. Led by the Canadian government, the push was on for the responsibility to protect, R2P, to those in the know. R2P was going to fix these problems that I've just described. Governments agreed at the very least, if not always, to intervene when there was a threat to human dignity. At the very least, there would be decisive, meaningful, effective international action when one of 4 threats appeared: a threat of genocide, of war crimes, of ethnic cleansing, or of crimes against humanity. And yet, even when confronted with precisely those threats within literally shooting range of the developed world, in the case of Syria, R2P delivered exactly nothing. Now, my point is not to be depressing about the state of public international law in terms of actually preventing harm, but is instead to be realistic about it. If we cannot yet, for all of the efforts that have been made, honestly guarantee the basic human dignity of people in their own states, and it seems to me that clearly we cannot yet do that, then ethically we have a core responsibility to enable people to vote with their feet. When things become impossible where they are, if we are incapable of fixing those problems, then we at the very least must let people who have the ability to get out do so and to remake their lives with dignity. That is an ethical imperative, and as I'll explain, it is also a legal imperative to which 3/4 of the world's governments have subscribed. Not to make this system work would, in my view, be a complete abdication of both law and ethicality. If and when we manage to get the international human rights and security systems to work more effectively, there will be fewer refugees. But it is no answer, it seems to me, to the need to reform the refugee system to say we hope one day these other systems will work, when we know that at present that is not the case. So that's the background to why I think we need to reform this system. A, we know it's not working, and B, we know there is no alternative to it at this point in history that dependably fixes the problems that produce refugees. So, what then about this refugee crisis we're facing? You've all seen that language. That's my third point. We do not have a refugee crisis. We may have a political crisis, we may have a crisis of will, but in any absolute objective sense, there is no refugee crisis, certainly not in Europe. Even if you add the Palestinian refugees into the official numbers, and for technical reasons the UN typically does not, but I will, at most we're talking about 25 million refugees in the world, which is 1/3 of 1% of the world's population. This is not a number that is unmanageable. This is a number that many might suggest is actually quite tiny. If 1/3 of 1% of the world's population falls into the category that we have guaranteed by international law to protect, then it seems to me that we are up against a challenge, not a crisis, one that can and should be fixed. It is a manageable imperative. It is not a crisis. Now, as my introductory remarks suggest, much of the thinking about refugees over the course of the last year has focused on the arrival of roughly 1 million refugees into Europe. And I'm going to start there as well, but I want to pull us back from that reality too, to think more broadly about the state of refugee protection in the world. 2016, quite frankly, got off to a very, very bad start for refugees in Europe. And no, I'm not speaking about perhaps what you think I am. For international lawyers, I think the most shameful moment came early in 2016, when NATO was conscripted to deter boat arrivals on the Mediterranean, boat arrivals that we knew had refugees on board. Invoking the vague language of fighting smuggling and trafficking, we somehow thought it was okay to use coercive force against people doing what international law allows them to do, namely to seek protection from persecution. We somehow demonized smuggling and trafficking, which I'm not in favor of, but I will say to you, I actually wrote a piece called In Defense of Human Smuggling. And I stand by that. In a world in which no government will give a visa to anyone to seek protection as a refugee, there is no alternative but to arrive unlawfully. You either lie about why you're coming, or you come without permission of any kind. Because were you to say that you're coming to seek asylum, you would not be given a visa. The Swiss government did it until recently. Even it has pulled back from its policy. So let's not demonize smuggling and trafficking when we know that there is thus far no alternative for people who wish to do what law allows them to do. Smugglers may be the least bad option, not a good option, but perhaps the least bad option when the risk is of loss of life or comparable harm in your home country. To send international forces out into international waters to force away people who were relying on smugglers to do what was necessary was, in my view, not only unlawful, but worse still, was a slap in the face of everyone who believes that refugees have a right to protection. It was dishonorable, and it was a very bad start to a very difficult year. Now, many of you will be more familiar, probably, with the so-called EU-Turkey refugee swap, and we'll talk a bit about that. Perhaps surprisingly, I am less angry about it than I am about the conscripting of NATO. Not because it was well done. It was horribly done. The European Union acted too late, after the fact, in a hastily conceived and administratively wobbly way that has created chaos. And I want to be clear that I am no fan of what is happening now in Greece in terms of removing refugees back to Turkey. But the reason I'm not happy with it has less perhaps to do with the predicate of what was intended than the way in which it was done. And I think it's important for advocates and scholars to stand back from the actual horror of the way it was done, to see whether, as I believe, there may not be the seeds of something positive in what was at least attempted, albeit, again, to underscore, incredibly poorly executed. First, for example, despite having said that people have the right to decide for themselves whether they wish to use a smuggler in order to seek protection. And by the way, Article 31 of the Refugee Convention precludes states from penalizing them for having used an unlawful means of arriving. Black and white, straightforward, not arguable. But despite the legality of arriving unlawfully, including by smuggler, it's not a pretty process. It is ridiculous, isn't it, that people should have to put their lives on the line in a tiny boat at the hands of a smuggler in order to save their lives. That's not what we want. It may be the least bad option, as I've suggested, but it's not a dignified means of enabling people to get the protection that international law provides for. Well, within the idea of the EU-Turkey refugee swap was, I think, something positive in this regard. That whether you showed up on a Greek island or were only able to make your way to a land border with Turkey, the ability to access quality protection would be the same. We would not favor the predominantly young, male, mobile people able and willing to take up the dangerous journey across the Mediterranean over the many, including many disabled with young families and otherwise unable to afford the smuggler who could only get to a land border. Europe would apply the United Nations vulnerability criteria, it said, to pick those who would come forward and receive protection in Europe rather than simply relying on accidents of wealth or accidents of relative temerity or braveness. That, I think, is a good thing. If we're going to have extra-regional asylum, it makes no sense to me to allocate it based upon who somehow manages to get onto a smuggling boat and survive the journey. A second thing, closely related, is this idea of really thinking about extra-regional resettlement as something that ought to be thought of as focusing on those who can't safely be protected at home. And again, it's unfortunate that Europe has said there will only be 72,000 people coming in from Turkey. Yes, it's a one-for-one swap, but up to a cap, badly executed. But could you imagine a system in which we actually did identify minorities, for example, sexual minorities clearly at risk in Turkey, and say to them, you have a greater need for asylum in Europe than perhaps someone who made their way onto a boat? I think that would be a good thing if we actually allocated it based upon need rather than other factors. A third possible bit of bright light is that the swap, if it's to be actually implemented, is going to require attention by European decision makers to the quality of what's available in Turkey. EU judges have already said that they're not going to simply countenance removals to places that don't live up to the meaning of protection. Well, that could be a positive. There are, as you will all know, 4 times as many refugees, nearly 5 times as many Syrian refugees living in 3 neighboring states as have arrived in the entirety of Europe. The quality of life for many of those refugees is not very high. The idea that interregional arrangements would allow us to shine the spotlight on less than happy practice by states where we typically, quite frankly, ignore what is going on. I mean, witness 2 decades of Kakuma and Dadaab in Kenya that the world barely noticed until finally this week when the Kenyan government announces it's going to close them. Then we notice. Did we notice 2 and 3 generations growing up in those camps? Hundreds of thousands, at times millions of people? No. Completely illegal what the government of Kenya did for decades. And yet we did nothing. I think the greater connectedness that schemes like the swap require could be a good thing for us paying more attention to what happens in places that are not quite as close to hand. And finally, and most important in my view, and this is the focus of what I'm going to be saying to you today, I think the refugee swap sought to bring order and predictability to the protection system. Again, it did a bad job of it. You know, I mean, the EU swap was conceived very quickly with insufficient study and insufficient thought. Right? It's a little bit like, you know, somebody decided that insurance was a good idea while their house was on fire. I mean, it is too little too late. But the idea that order and predictability could be a good thing both for refugees who wouldn't have to go through the chaotic horror of crawling under barbed wire, as well as for the states to which they arrive, seems to me to be correct. I want you to think this afternoon a little bit about what these seeds could produce. Again, not the mechanics of the deal as implemented, but imagine for just a moment what the refugee system would look like if we planned in advance how the financial burdens and the human responsibilities would actually be shared out. We had agreement before it happened. Imagine if we'd actually built in advance the administrative infrastructure to allow a more orderly and dignified protection process to succeed. And imagine, if you will, that the system wasn't just for Greece and Turkey, but a system for the whole world. Imagine that.
Imagine all the people.
All right, it's corny.
Sharing all the world.
But why not, right? What's wrong with imagining something? Isn't that what good international lawyers do? I mean, it's not just about applying the rules. Our job is to figure out how to make the rules real, how to make them actually inform the lives of real live people. If we know that the rules are not doing that, don't we have a responsibility as international lawyers to say so loudly, to say so unflinchingly? There are some assumptions, I regret to say, in some parts of the advocacy community that make this difficult. It's not just bad governments, although there are plenty of those that are precluding progress. One, I think, unfortunate piece of orthodoxy amongst many advocates is that a managed system of protection is a bad thing because it denies refugees absolute freedom of choice about where to be protected. And let me be candid, it does do that. And I don't shy away from it. The idea that refugee law has to be a disguised immigration system in which choices about where to live are sometimes, in some versions of this thesis, more important than whether everybody gets to a safe and dignified place is to me a problem. And I think we need to back off. If we hold states hostage to the view that everyone who arrives at their border will stay there indefinitely, we create an unfortunate political challenge for states that I fear will only lead to the erection of more barbed wire fences, if not worse. And to be equally candid, the refugees that groups with which I work have made clear that their primary goal is not to end up immigrating to a place of choice. It is to get to a place where they will be safe and can get on with their lives. And just to share with you one brief video from a refugee named Fadi who had arrived from Syria.
My name is Fadi. I'm Syrian. I'm from Damascus. Now as a refugee on the Hungarian border. I'm going any place can find a new home for me to be safe.
For being safe, a new home, right? I mean, this is not an immigration system. Refugee protection is a human rights system. It provides dignified protection for the duration of risk. We, I think, as scholars and advocates, do the system an injustice if we pretend otherwise. We force people like Fadi to live in the hellhole where he was living because states will erect barriers if they believe that every refugee is a disguised immigrant. And that, I think, is not in our interests. And so I want to be very clear that I think some element of refugee choice is important in making protection decisions. I'll describe in a moment work on preference matching that colleagues both at Oxford and in France and Spain are engaged with now that would factor into those decisions. We're holding a meeting on this subject in Vancouver in July. But the predicate is that people's dignity comes first and their choices about preferred destinations come second. We need to be sure that everybody gets what the Refugee Convention requires first and foremost. And it is not appropriate for us to hold people like Fadi hostage to projects that are more migration-based than protection-based. I actually think this possibility of swapping to a more managed system is our meal ticket to getting a global refugee compact in place. For the first time ever, states of the developed world actually believe that they have a problem that they can't fix on their own. It used to be either they thought it was the problem of the global south or that they could build enough barriers by non-entree practices or otherwise, which courts are increasingly striking down, and they are recognizing that they are vulnerable. And that vulnerability means that buying an insurance policy, to stick with that metaphor, is actually sensible for the first time. You know, if you are living in Amsterdam, you probably don't think earthquake insurance is a terribly good investment. If you're living in San Francisco, as I do, you may think very differently. I think for the first time, Europe is living in a San Francisco equivalent. And it's, except for the weather perhaps, it's finally realizing that it has something at stake that it needs to plan for, or it will find itself in a position that it finds very uncomfortable. Now, the other piece to this, if we're going to put forward the thesis that our negotiating chip with the developed world is their desire for orderliness, for management, is that this allows us to negotiate a deal that responds to this. The chart I'm showing you on the map that I'm showing you now on the screen points to the reality, the grotesque reality, that despite all of the whining, despite all of the calls of crisis, despite all of the angst-ridden politicians taking the stage in Europe, 80 to 85% of the world's refugees, even now, are in the global south. That has not changed in decades. The Syrian crisis has not changed that. Again, the overwhelming majority of the Syrians are also in the global south. They're not here. Indeed, 60% of the world's refugees live in just 10 countries, none of them particularly rich. Not only are the responsibilities of those states dramatically higher, but the rest of the world does virtually nothing to help them even pay for the costs of protection in a legally binding and dependable way. The countries with the least resources have the greatest responsibility to protect refugees. Who would ever conceive a system like that? It makes absolutely no sense. This would be like asking the bottom 5% of wage earners in Europe to pay 95% of the cost of running the European Union. Why would you do such a stupid thing? And yet, that is precisely the way the refugee system looks. Yes, developed countries give regular handouts to the less developed world. Woohoo. Nothing binding, nothing guaranteed, and those monies fluctuate with political, economic, and other priorities over time, so that those states have no guarantee whatever that if they do what we tell them to do, keep their doors open to refugees, that anybody will be there to assist them in coping. And again, what the global south has coped with for decades makes the last year in Europe look like a speck of sand on a very big beach. That, I think, is where we, as lawyers and scholars, need to be engaged. To get out of our tiny little pocket of the developed world and to think more broadly about how the system impacts on the overwhelming majority of the world's refugees. I mean, not only do we do almost nothing to guarantee payment for the system, but in human terms, our contributions are beyond pathetic. Of the 25 million or so refugees in the world, only about 100,000 were resettled last year. And in that, really only 3 countries, none of them in the European Union, did the overwhelming share of the work. That is utterly tragic. This is something that has got to end. If you think the refugee system is in crisis, well, this is the crisis. The crisis is that virtually all of the world's refugees are in very difficult places, which are getting next to no support from the rest of us. And here is where a managed system of refugee protection not only assists refugees to get a more dignified access of the kind Fadi was talking about, enables states of the developed world to plan and manage in the way that they are determined to do, but also assists states of the global south more meaningfully to respond to their obligations without finding themselves in a position of impossibility politically, economically, or otherwise. That's the opportunity I think we have a duty to try now to push. So before I tell you about the push, let me tell you what I would not suggest changing. And I want to be emphatically clear about this. This is not, underscore not, a call to renegotiate the UN Refugee Convention. That would be a huge, unmitigated disaster. The UN Refugee Convention has what, to my mind, is a definition of who is entitled to protection that is close to brilliant. It has evolved over the course of the years of the convention since 1951 in ways that we would never have imagined. We have, for example, now reached the point where, for example, refugees from war, so long as that war is in some sense connected to targeting people based on ethnicity or race or politics, which they nearly always are, qualify as convention refugees. We've reached a point where people at risk because of gender or sexuality or class, things that the drafters did not think about, are now routinely recognized as refugees. We've reached a point where the idea of being persecuted, the technical term in the definition, is inextricably tied to risks to core human rights values, something, again, the drafters had not thought of. In every one of those senses, this is a brilliant definition that is sacrificed at our peril. Perhaps equally important, but almost never talked about, is the rest of the Refugee Convention. I mean, you're sometimes, I go into meetings talking about refugee law, and I sometimes feel I'm living in a parallel universe. People talk about the definition in Article 1 and the duty of non-refoulement in Article 33. And it's like they can't do the math to figure out that there's more than 30 articles in between that nobody ever talks about. This is the core of the document. The core of the document is about empowering refugees to get on with their own lives as self-actuating, independent human beings. It is the opposite of the camp mentality. There is no mention of camps. Indeed, restrictions on freedom of movement are precluded as soon as a refugee is lawfully present, even before we've assessed her status. And yet the reality is nearly half the world's refugees live in camps, illegal camps. Refugees were not meant to be the recipients of charity. They were not meant to become burdens. They were not meant to be disfranchised or ostracized from their societies. All of the rights in the treaty are about integrating refugees, giving them the opportunity to work, to create businesses, to educate their children, and to be the authors of their own solutions. That is brilliant. In many ways, the rights that are there go way beyond rights that international human rights law provides more generally. So I'm not suggesting any tinkering at all with the refugee treaty. What I am suggesting is a lot of tinkering with the way we implement it. And indeed, it goes beyond tinkering. So the 5-point plan that I'll outline for you briefly is as follows. First, that we plan for rather than reacting to refugee movements. Secondly, that the regime be predicated on global burden and responsibility sharing. Third, that the norm be what environmental lawyers refer to as common but differentiated state responsibility. Everybody contributing, but not everybody doing the same job. Fourth, and this will hurt some of the international lawyers to hear, I apologize, we may all lose our jobs if my model were to be adopted, all of these advocates in the field, because we're spending far too much money now to process refugee claims for 15% of the world's refugees in the developed north, dramatically more than we spend on the other 85%. We need to move to a system where we allocate resources more sensibly and where we use the money to protect refugees rather than to hire lawyers, pay judges, and civil servants. And finally, we need a system that is serious about access both to protection in the first instance and to a real solution, not this ongoing debilitation of living for decades in refugee camps. That has got to end. And that's what this system will do. So let me quickly speak to the 5 elements, and then I'll look forward to our discussion. The planning point. The current system of episodic, ad hoc responses is just undignified for refugees and politically unpalatable for states. In the Secretary General's plan for what is billed as a momentous meeting on September 19th to reconsider all of these questions, under the grand heading of a global compact on responsibility sharing, we find actually a tepid, if not completely tragic, operationalizing principle, which is that if and when a crisis happens, states will agree in good faith to cooperate with UNHCR should it ask for help to try to make the system work better. Woohoo! I feel safe now. No, that is nonsense. The author of this report, quite frankly, should be ashamed of him or herself. If states simply get access to a process that might someday deliver them something, and they think they have the ability to slam the door shut on refugees that they're not sure are ever going anywhere, they will slam the doors shut. And again, if you do not think that the European lessons are being learned, you should watch what is happening in Kenya this week, where the government has declared that it will no longer maintain the prima facie refugee recognition of the Somalis that have been there for decades. If Europe can push them away, then why can't Kenya? And quite frankly, they're right about that. When the US government began interdicting Haitians in the high seas back in the 1980s, West African states emulated that practice. We've led the way. Bravo, developed world. You've shown the rest of the world how not to do refugee protection. What we need instead is a system that is out ahead of the crisis, where we are ready to respond at a moment's notice, not a commitment to plan and to hope that things will roll out over time. That is not good for refugees, and it's terrible for states. I've proposed what I call an IRRT, an International Refugee Response Team, that when refugees begin to flow is immediately dispatched, using largely prima facie group status determination. Most refugees do not need an individual hearing. More than 95% of the world's refugees are part of at-risk groups. Group identity and security concerns are the only questions. They do not need a big fancy $30,000 hearing to figure out if they are a refugee. Our systems waste money terribly on cases that are easily recognized, and indeed, which prima facie processes in the less developed world have shown to work for decades. So let's learn from that. Let's roll out the international team. Quickly vet their claims, issue the relevant identification cards. We did this with Nansen passports prior to the Second World War. We let an international agency do this. States agreed to honor them. We can go back to that. I'll show you in a moment that the savings we make from this will fund what we need in the rest of the system, but equally important, they will make sure that doors don't get slammed shut, hoping that somebody might come through with a promise of some kind at some point. What this means is that when the refugee response team arrives, the international vetting of refugee status will happen quickly. There will be, however, no guarantee that the person will be protected in the place where he or she arrives. She will be protected in line with the Refugee Convention somewhere. But arriving in Miami might lead to protection in Costa Rica. Arriving in Athens might lead to protection in Morocco. And I'm not going to equivocate about this. If the standard of protection actually does verifiably reach that of the Refugee Convention, including all of its rights, not just non-refoulement, then the refugee does not have a right to decide where to be protected. But we don't ask that question often enough. Even in the EU-Turkey swap, UNHCR seemed to be fixated about whether it was collective expulsion or not. Well, quite frankly, that's a secondary issue. The primary issue should have been, from the start, can Turkey, a non-party state effectively, because it does not recognize non-Europeans as refugees, be reliably, legally, verifiably relied upon to guarantee the rights in a treaty that actually don't bind it vis-a-vis these refugees? That's the question I would have been asking right from the start. And only if the other state does live up to those obligations would it be considered part of this regime. The idea of getting rid of this by actually finding alternatives to reassure states so they don't erect these kind of barriers seems to me to be our first point of departure. If we have not addressed the access issue, we have not helped anybody. And that does not mean commitments down the road. It means immediate, actionable commitments. That ties into the second point. We need a system in which states agree in advance to their fair share of both the human responsibility and the financial burdens of refugee protection. And I speak about those two ideas separately. I do not believe in trading off money for people. States should do both to the extent of their ability. No one should be able to buy their way out of the regime. But the two questions are different. And in this regard, the European Union's formula, for example, I think bungled the issue. It came up with a common formula that included both financial and human criteria and mixed them together as though it were the same. They're not. Your ability to actually receive refugees, for example, I think has more to do with your space, your population density, your unemployment rate, your prior refugee admissions. Your ability to contribute financially may have more to do with your GDP, your debt, and how much overseas aid you're already providing. But these two questions are not the same. Now, again, we may differ about the precise formulas that would inform what I'm going to colloquially speak about as an insurance regime for refugees. But we can find answers to this. We have formula for other UN and related budgetary and human responsibilities. This is well within our capacity. And as I said to you a moment ago, there are two teams of economists working right now on preference matching schemes that would actually allow refugee preferences to be factored into these objective criteria to come up with the best possible result of who goes where. But the idea that the responsibilities and burdens are assigned by chance or by accidents of geography, to put it more clearly, is just wrong. The UN agency needs to have, if it's going to be able to react as quickly as we need to react to keep the doors open, the ability to draw on what we might, sticking with the analogy, think of as the premiums that have been paid into the insurance plan in order to find both the funds and the place for people to go. Now, not in a month. That leads to the third point. I don't see any value in a regime that is unnecessarily rigid. The current refugee regime assumes, completely falsely, but assumes that every state that has signed the treaty will do every refugee job. It will keep its borders open to those who arrive. It will provide immediate permanent solutions to, for example, unaccompanied minors and other particularly precarious cases. It will protect everybody else for the duration of risk. It will find solutions for everyone who can't go home. I mean, how many countries actually do all of that? The answer is very few, and fewer still do all of those jobs well. We know, for example, that Nordic countries have traditionally been extraordinarily good on the high-cost, extremely difficult permanent resettlement cases. We know that countries like the US, Canada, and Australia have figured out how to do resettlement well. And indeed, Canada, over the last 6 months, figured out how to do a dramatically intensified resettlement operation without compromising security at all in a tiny fraction of the time that it's traditionally taken. We should let states do, at a human level, things that they are good at. We need all of these jobs. The only job that every state would take on is that initial access point. A refugee is entitled to get into the international system wherever she can physically arrive. No state, and I want to again be clear on this, all of these ridiculous visa controls, carrier sanctions, non-entree mechanisms, deterring boats on the high seas, this has got to end now. And I think, in fact, if the place you arrive is not necessarily the place where you will stay, that the states of destination will have many fewer incentives to erect those barriers. If arrival only gets you into the international system somewhere, then what is your interest as that destination state in precluding arrival? Whatever it is, it's dramatically less than it is now, where the assumption is wherever you arrive is where you're going to stay. And indeed, the Commission's proposal last week in Europe maintained what, in my view, is the very unfortunate Dublin rule, that first country arrival is the predominant way of assigning responsibility. Yes, if you reach 150% of capacity, we'll try to shift some people around. Why 150%? If 100% is capacity? Anyway, I don't know where they're coming from, and the rule is an idiotic rule to begin with. There's no reason initially to assign people to the place where they first arrive. It's not in the Refugee Convention, and it makes no practical sense. So why don't we just get away from all of this and start actually assigning responsibilities in ways that work? I mean, the truth of the matter is we desperately need states doing some things that are not being done right now. We're all, I understand, fixated on this idea of having a functional asylum system, but that may not be the best investment of European and other extra-regional state resources. Remember, we've got more than 80% of the world's refugees in less developed countries right now. And as noble as much of their record has been, it is also the case that if we're equally candid about it, much of what passes for protection in the global south is not worthy of the name. The idea that people live like this, not for weeks or months, not even for years, but for decades on end, with absolutely no solution in sight, ought to horrify every person in this room. That, to my mind, is the real refugee crisis. We need answers to places like that, not simply answers to the people who show up on a Greek island. The reality today is that 2/3 of the global refugee population have been waiting on average at least 17 years for a solution with none in sight. Think about that for just a second. For many of you in the room, 17 years is what? 3/4 of your life? You've been sitting in a refugee camp all that time, and there is still absolutely no sign as to how your predicament is going to be fixed. How are you going to feel? Gee, do you think there might be a security risk in a camp like that? Do you think somebody might want to strike out at the people who are keeping them behind barbed wire? Do you think people might be debilitated and therefore unable to get on with their lives even if you give them the opportunities? Well, yeah. And yet that's been the dominant model for the last several decades. Imagine that apart from the one common duty to keep your door open to the arrival of refugees, different countries did different jobs. In particular, it seems to me sensible that countries within the region of origin, to the extent they exist and are safe and reliable partners, do, for reasons of logistics, the ability to test repatriation, and cultural and other functionality, it seems to me that they sensibly do, as they do now, most of that initial protection for duration of risk. The 5, 6, 7 years of protection, rights regarding protection, not that would actually enable refugees to get on with their lives, be productive, and hope for the possibility of return to their own country, which of course is what most refugees want. But we have virtually nobody doing the job for the other half of the refugee population who have no place to go after 5, 6, 7 years. Nobody, apart from the piddling contributions of 100,000 per annum, is providing permanent solutions to refugees. And that's where I think the action needs to be. In fact, it needs to be at two fronts that I'll describe as I go through this. We need to make local integration more palatable. An excellent piece of research done at Oxford's Refugee Studies Center has shown how actually liberating refugees from from movement constraints and letting them work enables them to be productive contributors to domestic GDP in ways that no one, perhaps, certainly not the Donald Trumps of the world, would want to recognize. Refugees can be the engines of development, and local integration can be an extraordinarily attractive option. But for those for whom return is not possible and local integration does not work, the system I'm proposing guarantees, underscore guarantees, that 5, 6, 7 years out, they are offered resettlement in a state party that will let them get on with their lives for the long haul. No more protracted refugee situations. No more piddling 100,000 places a year. And that's what I think we can negotiate now. The leaders with whom I have spoken have shown an openness to dramatically intensified resettlement if that is the core of their human responsibility to refugees. And while I understand that for many advocates that feels like a place you don't want to go, rethink that assumption. Because, again, if this is your life, the idea that we invest so much in fancy asylum systems in the developed world, ignoring the possibility of tackling this, is an ethical abdication of responsibility. The most shocking part of all of this is that not only could we provide access and dramatically reduce, if not eliminate, protracted refugee situations, but we could probably do it for about the same amount of money we're spending now. Yeah, you heard me right. The economists who worked on the reformulation model found that the money we are already spending in the refugee protection system around the world would be more than enough not only to fund the simplified status assessment up front, the invigorating process of protection for duration of risk, where refugees are given startup grants and able to get on with their lives to help themselves and their communities, to fund the protection systems, to fund the resettlement, to fund the admission. All of that can come out of what we are now spending. Even 25 years ago, Europe and Canada combined were spending 10 times the entire UNHCR budget running our domestic protection systems. As of last year, it was reported that one country, the United Kingdom alone, was spending more on its refugee protection system than the entire UNHCR budget for 85% of the world's refugees. Australia today spends more to run the review stage of its inland refugee system that benefits virtually nobody than it contributes to the entire global protection regime outside Australia. Now, this is nuts. We are doing this right now. And again, I understand that to an audience of lawyers, saying that we need fewer bureaucrats, fewer lawyers, and fewer judges may sound like anathema. But this is a refugee protection system, not a legal protection system for lawyers, judges, and bureaucrats. We are, I think, urgently compelled to rethink fancy status determination systems in favor of simplified interviews that vet identity and any security concerns, as among the 95% of the world's refugees who flee group-based harm. We do not need a 4-hour hearing to figure out if most Syrians are refugees. This is an easy, easy case. Let's not waste the money going through the motions. Let's instead quit throwing the money to the wind and put that money into efficient, upfront, largely prima facie group status determination. Let's put it into refugee startups that enable them to become quickly productive and benefit host communities. And let's put it into actually facilitating long-term solutions that give refugees places to go. We can do all of that with the money in the system. We can be setting up shops and businesses rather than camps. And that leads to the final point. Everything I've talked about today is ultimately directed to one thing, which is getting refugees not only to protection, but enabling them to get on with their lives. Again, I want to emphasize, protracted refugee situations in horrid camps are the norm for refugee protection in the world today. The norm, not the aberration. That is something that we have to take on if we actually believe in the equal moral worth of all human beings, not just the ones we see. Most refugees, of course, do want to go home. I get that. And if the human rights, security, and R2P work better than they are presently, more would be able to go home. But we're still getting a significant percentage of the world's refugees home, but not as great as we did 20 years ago when the majority were able to go home in 5, 6, or 7 years. And that means that some things in our model did need to change from what it looked like when first proposed 20 years ago. We could not rely on repatriation as the way of getting all refugees to solutions. We needed to reinvigorate local integration and particularly resettlement. No more of this voluntary resettlement stuff. Treat resettlement as an integral part of the protection paradigm. Treat it for what it is. It is a way of providing a solution. Before you get there, do what Emily Arnold Fernandez calls setting up refugee cities, what Alex Betts calls incubator cities. Small startup grants that allow refugees to be productive where they are, to be ready for a solution and able to meet their own needs. And let's really move from a crazy system in which resettlement is around for maybe 1% of the world's refugee population to a system in which it plays a role for a very significant percentage of refugees who wouldn't otherwise have the ability to restart their lives. All of that can be done without changing one word in the 1951 Refugee Convention. Indeed, the drafters of the convention in the preamble called for burden and responsibility sharing, a promise that the UN Refugee Agency and states have steadfastly ignored for more than 60 years. I think the current crisis is an opportunity to actually see more people moving toward permanent solutions, fewer people waiting forever. It does not mean that the five-point plan is ready to roll out. When the group of 70-odd people, including 6 governments that I led 2 decades ago, presented our proposals, we knew that they were not ready to roll out. We called for careful modeling and test piloting regionally, sub-regionally to get the ball moving. What angers me is not that the model hasn't been implemented. What angers me is that governments today are asking the same questions they were asking 20 years ago and doing almost as little to find a real answer to it. The answers are here. Experiment with it, work with it, plan with it, try it. Do not throw away the opportunity of the September 19th meeting on vague hortatory language about how good it would be if we all collaborated with each other. We do not need more motherhood statements. What we need is a workable system to implement the obligations we've signed on to. Refugees deserve that. We do not want to see the world continuing to look like this. And mark my words, if advocates and scholars do not take up the torch in favor of reviewing how we implement the treaty, governments that have the wherewithal to build those fences are going to continue to do it. And yes, that does mean we're going to see more scenes like this, which I know none of us want to see. And so let me end where I began, by asking us all, as people committed to protection, as lawyers committed to human dignity and refugee rights, to be a little more imaginative.
I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one.
Yeah, that's in the original.
I hope someday you'll join us. And the world will be as one.
Not forgetting about them just because we don't see them. Thanks very much. So I think we have a bit of time for questions, comments, debate. Who would like to start? And we have microphones to bring to you, so if you want to ask a question, if you can raise your hand so that I think, oops, where are our microphones? One there, and the second one, is there a second one or only one?
I think there's only one.
Okay, so raise your hand if you'd like to speak. Why don't we've got a question in the middle row here? Yep. If everybody could be helpful in passing the mic quickly as you can. Thank you.
Do you think
Hi,
that
Iris.
Hi. Do you think implementing this system would also encourage countries that haven't signed the convention yet to sign it?
Yes, thank you for that question. And I think that's something we really do need to think about, right? A quarter of the world's governments have not signed on to the regime at all, including some really critical players, particularly in South and Southeast Asia, that have steadfastly stood outside the regime on the grounds that it would expose them to unlimited liability that they're not prepared to take on. Again, if you were India, to take one example of a state that has made this point, sitting where India is sitting, would you sign the Refugee Convention, knowing that the rest of the world owes you absolutely nothing if refugees begin arriving, either financially or in terms of human sharing? And the Indian government has made that point. I think that is exactly right. We'll not only do a better job by refugees and the states already in the system, but by offering a meaningful insurance regime that enables states to calculate their exposure and thoughtfully sign on, I think we will have more accessions. something that, by the way, has completely stalled for the last decade. There have been virtually no new accessions to the Refugee Treaty in a decade. I think precisely because governments understand that it's politically and economically and perhaps otherwise risky. Where's the microphone, sir? Yeah, can you? We won't do it all in the front section. We'll pass the mic to the back for the next group. Go ahead.
Thanks very much for an inspiring and thought-provoking talk. I actually wanted to get back to your point about the definition in the Refugee Convention, which you called close to brilliant. One of the things that's been a repeated point of contention here in the Netherlands is the emphasis on political persecution and the distinction between economic migrants and political persecution. And I'm wondering what your take is on that,
right,
given that the distinction is increasingly difficult to make, given the type of conflicts we face today.
See, and I actually don't find the distinction difficult to make, so maybe you and I are coming at this slightly differently. My students know that the surest way to fail my course is ever to use the expression economic refugee. That's an instant failure, right? You're either a refugee or you're an economic migrant. And as senior courts throughout the world have said, if you meet the refugee definition, the fact that you also want economic betterment or a better future for your family is legally irrelevant. So yes, do most people arriving in an asylum state have some motivation other than simply protection? I mean, my answer would be duh, right? Which one of you has a singular motivation for everything you do, right? You think that by taking a certain course of action, you achieve A, but if you achieve B and C along the way, there's nothing wrong with that. If everyone, make it more blunt. If you needed to flee tomorrow, where would you go? Well, certainly you're not going to aim for the first country of arrival, I can tell you that much. That's not exactly a very informed choice about where to seek protection. But you'd say, where will I be safe? And you'd probably ask, where could I work? Where could I get on with my lives? Where would my kids be safe? So those two concepts, I think, are artificially juxtaposed. If a person is going to be persecuted by economic means, because you're black, you can't work, for example, again, senior courts have routinely recognized that's a risk of being persecuted by economic rather than civil and political means. So I think we actually have a false debate going on here. The Syrians, ironically, have perhaps raised this, tragically, because as among recent refugee populations, the Syrians have actually brought enormous economic skills to Europe with them. How sad that they should be damned for being people who brought productive backgrounds with them, even as they needed to seek protection. Shame on you for being a good businessman. We don't want that in Europe. Angela Merkel, I have to say, got this right. Not only did she stand up ethically for what the Refugee Convention meant, but she was a smart enough politician to recognize that these refugees provided precisely what a failing social welfare state needed in terms of a young and productive workforce, right? So I think part of what we need to say very clearly is, if you are a refugee, the fact that you are also motivated by familial, economic, or other concerns is legally irrelevant. And the top courts of the world have said that, and we need to repeat it as often as we need to when people suggest otherwise. Now, I don't see any hands at the back, so I'm going to keep the microphone where it is until one of you suggests otherwise. Do you want to just pass the mic back then, and we'll just move it around the circle? Jean, I think that's you.
Or maybe ladies first.
No, go ahead. You've got it in your hand. Let's just do it.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to be slightly subversive, but you are subversive, and I know you appreciate that. Actually, I just want to make a point and invite you to be even more subversive.
Oh, gracious.
Because you contemplate a reform from within.
Yep.
From within the current refugee law framework. I'm just wondering whether we shouldn't be even more radical and just step out completely of the refugee law framework, which may be part of the problem. Because with the refugee law framework, we stick to one narrative, which is a narrative of refugees, of smuggler, of burden. And that, in a way, perpetuates the problem and reinforces the problem. So shouldn't we just...
Where do you want to go instead?
Well, redefine completely the whole issue. I don't know what...
Well, give me a sense of what you mean by that.
What about speaking about human capital? I mean, I don't know, maybe trade law has something to say, maybe law has nothing to say about this.
Yeah, but see, I don't think, again, these two are mutually exclusive. I mean, you can make a very powerful case, which I am not making. Somebody said this was a very ambitious topic title, but my title is not how to change the world, right? I mean, I think you can make a very powerful case that open borders are economically smart, that by and large, they are net sources of economic as well as social enrichment, but they're a lot more effective than overseas development assistance. And in a whole lot of ways, it makes sense. But that's not what I'm arguing for here. I mean, if we had that, we wouldn't need an exception to migration control if we had no migration control. My view is, as much as I find it intriguing, I think we are not yet at that point politically. I do not think many states would buy the logic of open borders as a sensible policy prescription. Were we there, my job would be done. If people could simply move, which, by the way, until the beginning of the 20th century, they simply did, right? Refugee law only arose once the UK and then continental Europe began to actually establish migration control. It was only then that we needed an exception for urgent needs. If you undercut the norm, then you've, by definition, eradicated the need for the exception. But I think it's a little bit like what I said at the beginning about the human rights and security systems. I mean, if we actually do what those systems say we should be doing, and it works, there aren't going to be any refugees. We don't need to trade them off. The palliative system will be moribund if the illness doesn't occur. So whether it's by open migration or a better human rights security system, I'm with you and happy to go there. But in the interim, I think it's important to fix what can be fixed so that the millions of people who are calling upon this system now, until and unless we make those changes, actually have a way to implement the rights, not that we're saying should be there, but that 3/4 of the world's governments have already signed on to, for heaven's sake. And so I'm showing my positivist stripes. I see nothing wrong as a human rights lawyer in saying we begin with what states have already agreed to and we find ways to make it workable for them to live up to those obligations. But I agree with you that if we can work to a world in which either borders don't matter or where security and human rights work, then my project would be unnecessary and I would be a very happy man. We've got 2 questions next door to you and then we'll send the mic back to this side of the room. So the gentleman and the lady, you decide who goes first.
I'm just curious, in your view, where what's the role of naturalization of refugees? Because you seem to be suggesting a much more vigorous system of return of people and not have voluntary return and really pushing people back. Yet the Refugee Convention encourages integration and encourages naturalization. It seems unfair that someone who's living abroad for 10, 20 years can't naturalize and become a citizen of that. But then the problem is then it becomes an immigration system again.
Well, yes and no, right? And by the way, I don't think I'm actually pushing people anywhere. If anything, it's the opposite, right? The old system assumed that refugees stayed in a living hell until we could somehow send them home. What I'm suggesting is the opposite, that we reinvigorate local integration and resettlement as parts of the protection paradigm. I'm recognizing that, in fact, legally, the cessation clauses that would enable us to require people to go home are much less likely to be applicable today than they were 20 years ago. The conflicts are going on longer. The difficulties are more intractable. We need new answers, not just the hope of pushing back. So I want to be clear about that before we go any further. The idea of naturalization is built into the Refugee Treaty. Again, this is why we do not need a new treaty. Article 34 already says states have a duty to consider naturalization in good faith. Do they have to grant it? No, but they do have to have a process. And they do have to consider it in good faith. My own view on this, and I'm subject to correction, is that the more critical imperative is to get the whole bundle of rights in the Refugee Treaty. If you actually have complete mobility, the right to work, to educate your kids, access to the social welfare system, etc., the political franchise that might accompany becoming a citizen, while not unimportant, is, I think, of a lesser order of magnitude. I do not yet see us as, again, being at the point where every country will do what countries like the United States and Canada routinely do, which is to assume that every refugee can become a citizen. I'm in favor of that model for people who are resettled, But I think the more important thing is to make sure that when we move people, we are not relying, as some governments have suggested, on the simple fact that they won't be sent back to their country of persecution, but on what I would call social enfranchisement. As the Chief Justice of Australia said in the case against the Australian swap to Malaysia, that also ought to be social enfranchisement that is legally enforceable, not promises. So that's where I want to start. If we can get to citizenship, in addition, I'm thrilled. But first and foremost, as Fadi said in the slide that I showed you, I think people want to get to a place where they're safe and where they can get on with their lives. We're so far away from enfranchising all refugees as citizens when most refugees are effectively treated as animals to be kept captive that, again, my incrementalism is perhaps coming through, but I think let's get what we've already promised them first and then focus on the broader issue of citizenship. Lady behind you.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm quite interested on the welfare state and the implications that accepting refugees has on the welfare state. Mm-hmm. Some authors have argued that by accepting more refugees, there will be a decrease in welfare provisions for the entire state. And they argued that in order to combat that, then the government should implement more integration policies, so more contact between national citizens and refugees as a way to maybe,
sure.
I don't know, because I was quite shocked when I heard that because we accept refugees, then people will vote for less welfare provisions.
Right.
Because there's always this trade-off with the budget.
Well, and in fact, that idea of integration, again, is precisely what the Refugee Convention requires. I mean, it is really striking to situate the reality that most refugees have been assigned to camps, and while refugees do not have freedom of movement, cannot make decisions for themselves, and are effectively rendered basket cases by our policies, with the provisions in the Refugee Convention that preclude any restriction on freedom of movement once we've vetted identity and security concerns, even before the claim is assessed, with rules that give refugees access to not only work but to self-employment and investment opportunities. Tax equality, for God's sake, is in the Refugee Convention. This convention was designed, it took them 3.5 years to set this treaty up. It was designed to enfranchise refugees and to enable them to be productive. By definition, that means associations with the host community. When I talked about Alex Bett's idea of refugees as incubators, that is precisely the philosophy that underpins the model I'm proposing. That refugees not only can look after themselves, but can be engines for development, whether as part of a social welfare state or otherwise. We need to liberate refugees to play that role, which is not only reducing the cost of detention, but is providing revenue toward actually enabling the state to be productive both in the short and in the long term. So, the social science research supports precisely what you're saying. But, as someone once pointed out to me in relation to this proposal, a good idea does not necessarily make a reality, right? And that's part of our problem.
Yeah, I was wondering though, because it feels like integration policies are organized on a local level, but not on a national scale. But
sure.
I don't know if I'm correct, but it seems more logical to have some kind of system that organizes integration of refugees on a national scale.
Well, I'm not sure I entirely agree with you there. And I will actually draw in this respect on the Canadian experience, which I do think, I'm not just being a nationalist here, I think the Canadian resettlement approach is the best in the world. They've recently announced a new approach that marries the idea of governments identifying particularly vulnerable and deserving cases with private host communities and organizations taking on a lot of the responsibility for that integration. So the opposite, in a sense, of what you're saying. The reason for that is that the evidence shows that refugees actually do much better when they have people at the local level who are deeply connected to them rather than simply a bureaucrat in the capital. And so I don't think we should underestimate the value of human connectedness. And I really, think the research bears that out, that we're more likely to generate positive results when refugees are people rather than phenomena or waves or influxes or something else. And the way we do that is by connecting.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. I think we've got a question at the back, and then maybe if we've hit our timeline, we'll see how we're doing. The very last row. Yep.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Sure.
In particular, I was very happy with your comment on the EU-Turkey refugee swap, as you called it. But as you know, there are a lot of concerns. And that's always a difficulty in the discussion about the plan, that there are all these problems and concerns.
Right.
You probably know what I'm talking about. Now, my question to you is very clearly, what is your advice to our Prime Minister to deal with those concerns? Because we need a little bit of instruments to have the debate in our Parliament, which I think is very poor at the moment, on that plan. Yeah. So I would like to have your wisdom, what direction we should direct our Prime Minister.
Look, I'll give the Dutch government, were it to ask, which it hasn't, I would give it the same advice that I gave to the Canadian government 2 weeks ago, which is, for all of my pessimism about a formal meeting at the General Assembly, at the United Nations on September 19th, I think it is a focal point to at least lock in a process with clear time deadlines and markers for achievement on actually achieving a global compact on a system of shared responsibility for refugees. Not the rhetorical nonsense that is presently in the Secretary General's background study. What we need actually to do is to engage the mechanics of how this will work, and we're not going to do that between here and September. So my advice would be, say to the UNHCR, which is managing this part of the process for the Secretary General, that you do not want any more rhetorical commitments, that neither the population of Europe nor indeed the populations in the South that receive most refugees are happy with the system, and that it is not serving refugees well. That it is time now to actually do what the drafters of the Convention prognosticated in 1951 and set up the system to manage burdens and responsibilities, and get that firm commitment to a process this September with benchmarks, deliverables, so that by the 65th anniversary of the Refugee Convention in 3 years' time, we actually have, I would hope, a protocol on the table that would operationalize global shared responsibility for refugees. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have hit that 5:30 mark. It is not quite as sunny as it was when we began, but there is still a little bit of beautiful afternoon left. I want one more time, if I may, to thank the organizers, the European Law Students Association and the European Society of International Law, for the opportunity to speak with you. And I want to leave you with the encouragement not simply to walk away from this conversation, but to engage it now. This is going to be, perhaps, certainly in my lifetime, I believe, the last opportunity that the developed world will take this issue seriously enough to reform the way we do protection. You guys may have one more shot, but by the time it reaches you, you'll be as old and bald as me. So grab it. Grab it now. Pressure the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to do a better job on its proposals. Pressure your government to insist upon that. Pressure traditional advocates who focus domestically to think globally instead. And above all, think hard about the refugees we don't see as much as the refugees we do see. If we can manage to engage that level of conversation, there is a chance that the next time a horror show happens, and tragically it will happen again, that people do not find barbed wire waiting for them. They do not find horrid camps waiting for them. They do not find badly implemented swaps being thought of at the last moment for them. But they actually come upon a system that works, that delivers dignity, and which generates solutions rather than perpetual encampment. So thank you for that. And I hope you'll be with me on this important journey and engage it orally and in writing with everyone you can, as loudly as you can. Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrea. Yep. Thank you, Jeff.